Hello.
Hello.
Welcome back. So we're just going to, Ms. Easton, we haven't quite finished this morning's business. So we've got one more policy to discuss before we move on to delivering places. That policy is PP 14, which is priority areas for regeneration.
Okay, I'll turn my camera off and come in when needed.
Okay. So in relation to this, my first question was to do with the implications for flood risk, but I see that the Statement of Common Ground produced with the EEA effectively covers some of the issues that were in that question. Is there anything you'd like to add to what's been said in that Statement of Common Ground, or are you happy for me to just proceed on that basis?
No, I'd only like to add, Ma'am, I have been recently working on the Jaywick Sands Place plan over a couple of years, and actually we have monthly meetings with the EA on that, and actually working out some of the flood risk components and how to provide better housing for people in Jaywick Sands is actually integral to dealing with the flood risk issues. And so these are ongoing discussions with the EA, and the flood risk small elements of flood risk assessments are being carried out all the time, and ways of actually improving defences are being looked at. So it's an ongoing dialogue, as mentioned in the Statement of Common Ground. So I think that's been covered in the Statement of Common Ground, and EA have reiterated that fact.
Okay. So looking then generally at the wording of the policy, just opening it up now. So what is the policy seeking to achieve?
I agree. It isn't a detailed development control policy. I think what it is saying is these are the backgrounds. These are initiatives that are currently the council are involved in terms of looking at solving particular key problems, and there's background studies and place plans and regeneration initiatives going on in these places, and they are a focus for inward investment by the council. So what we're really doing is, the local plan is also a spatial plan in a sense. What we are also telling people that are looking at the plan, looking at investing in the district, that these are potential opportunities they may want to get involved in. We're also signalling to the development control officer, you've got a development in this location, the council may well have a piece of land that it's looking to develop for a particular community use or regeneration in the initiative. Just be aware that there is something going on here that you may need to take account of. And as obviously strategies are developed and public consultation takes place on those strategies, they can gain some kind of material consideration in a development control decision. But obviously they will need at some point to be included in the local plan. So I think it's really highlighting what the sort of strategies and target interventions the council is addressing in those particular locations. I think it is in line with paragraph 21 of the NPPF, which says the local authority should identify priority areas for economic regeneration, infrastructure provision, and environmental enhancements. I think it's also a basis for us to undertake supplementary planning documents where required.
Sorry, which paragraph were you saying? 21?
Yes.
Of 2012?
Yes, paragraph 21 of M. Yeah. I'll check that.
Yeah. So how does the policy direct applicants in relation to how development should occur in those areas?
I don't think it does give a very specific targeted. It's just really stating to the applicants there are regeneration initiatives going on there. You might want to be aware of these when you're putting in a proposal.
Okay. So what are the council's regeneration aims for the area?
Well, we have certain the main ones are listed there in the in the policy, which is the Clacton Town Centre and seafront, and there's proposals to rejuvenate the town centre. Jaywick Sands, which are proposals to, we've just got £4.5 million worth of funding for employment uses in Jaywick Sands, which will take place on a council-owned site. We're also looking at ways of actually replacing the existing houses there, and those are there's lots of different ideas that are being discussed. There's ideas around building new houses and giving people appropriate financial support to move to new accommodation, but there's also ideas about how replacement dwellings can take place in Jaywick Sands, which are flood resilient as well. There's various initiatives.
Specifically about the last sentence of the policy, where it says the council will support proposals for new development which are consistent with achieving its regeneration aims. Is there a place where the regeneration aims of the council are specifically set out? Is there a specific document?
Well, I think it's being set out in those documents, but also it would be set out.
Sorry, which documents?
In those documents outlined above. But also,
which ones? Which documents outlined above?
So the Jaywick Sands place, but I think you're looking for a high-level policy, strategic policy, which that hooks into. I just need to, if someone can give me those references.
Just wondering how someone who was approaching development in one of those areas, I understand the policy is broad brush. It's not going to be very extremely detailed on every level, but I wondered how, apart from just signposting to someone coming into the area that this is a regeneration area, how they would know what the general regeneration aims of the council are, and how they were going to be achieved, and what someone coming in would need to be aware of in order to hook out into that. So I'm assuming you've got a high-level strategic document which sets those out. I mean, you've mentioned this plan for Jaywick Sands quite a few times, but that's still at an early stage, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think it's just highlighting that is going on there, and that will become more of a material consideration as those plans are produced.
Okay, so there aren't any strategic aims as such.
I just need to. There would be strategic. There's obviously general strategic policies that say that we are looking to regeneration initiatives in the district, but they are set out also in 7.5.6 of our planning statement, which lists all the regeneration initiatives in the borough.
I'm looking here. I've gone into the evidence base, and I'm looking at for the prosperous places, and I've got the documents under regeneration, which you've got the Harwich Master Plan, Harwich Quayside Design Statement, Dover Court Master Plan, Walton Regeneration Framework, and the Clacton Town Centre Business Case. would they be a starting point for everywhere other than Jaywick?
Sorry, can you just give me the reference again for that?
Sorry, there are 5 documents listed, EB 6.5.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 and 0.5. I've got, for example, 6.5.5 is the Walton Regeneration Framework. So
yes.
And it's a big document. It must have lots of pictures in it because it's taken a long time for it to open up on my system. That dates from a while ago. That's January 2010. And you've mentioned, I mean, there's a Harwich Quayside Design Statement. That's from 2007. Dover Court Master Plan Revisited. That's opening up now. That's 2019. Harwich Master Plan.
That's right. Clacton Town Centre business case as well.
Yeah.
Maybe 6.5.1. So all those would come under this particular policy, including the ones actually stipulated in the policy as well, and emerging ones.
Okay. There's been quite a few, in this one, the Regeneration of Old Harwich dates from 2005. There's been also mentioned quite a few times of Jaywick Place Plan. Is that still in its infancy?
Yes, it's we've got a design team looking at, and a regeneration team looking at that. It hasn't been out to initial formal consultation yet. Actually, due to the COVID-19 situation, so that's still waiting to be progressed. And it's actually quite a bit. The actual plan is actually more of a spatial plan because it's involving lots of social initiatives to tackle deprivation in those issues. So it's a lot more encompassing than a pure planning document.
Yeah, I think the point I'm driving at is if you were like me coming into an area that I'm not from Essex, Google Jaywick, the sort of stuff that I'm going to say about, most deprived ward in the country, etc. And so I was a little surprised that there wasn't more in the plan to deal with those kind of issues. I appreciate that the big issues and they're multidimensional, and that the council is onto it and that it's developing its place plan. But the plan doesn't really say an awful lot. And whilst I appreciate there may not be an awful lot to be said in a specific policy, I just expected there to be more in relation to. I wondered why you needed to be more explicit in even in the supporting text of this policy about the range of work that the council was doing and how those regeneration aims could be, how a developer coming into the area would know what those regeneration aims are. Do you see the point I'm getting at?
Yes, I do actually. I'd be happy to put some of that in the supporting text to provide some context for that.
Yeah, because we don't know. I mean, for example, we know that the council is going to support proposals that meet regeneration aims, but we don't know what they are.
We don't know what the precise interventions are going to be at this stage in terms of those, and it's we can't put something into the plan that we haven't consulted the local community on. That would be wrong to do that. So yes, it's a bit of a we need to have done the work and the consultation to understand what interventions needs to take place.
Okay, so what do you propose you're going to do about it?
Well, we can expand the text to discuss some of those regeneration initiatives and give people a flavour of what's happening in those locations.
Okay.
We don't want to make it too long, but at least we can expand on it. So it's more. So I think what you want is it to be highlighted in the plan a little bit more as to what's happening in those areas.
Because if you read the plan, you'd think absolutely nothing is happening, which I'm sure isn't true.
It's not true, no.
But that's not what I get from the plan. So this might be an opportunity just to address that and to say, I appreciate. I'm not asking you to write a whole new policy for PP14 because it has to be accurate in reflecting not what's actually going on. But I do think you might have missed a bit of a trick there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm happy to include that.
I think also you need to think about that last sentence, because actually it doesn't. If there aren't any regeneration aims, the last sentence doesn't mean anything.
Well, I think the regeneration aims are to improve the quality of life and the economic well-being of those areas. And that might say
that then.
Yeah.
Yeah, say that.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put that in.
Okay. And which other at-risk conservation areas?
Oh, I'll have to wait. Yeah.
Just Harwich.
I need to get some advice on that. I don't know that off the top of my head. Just waiting for it. There are apparently 5. There are 5 at-risk conservation areas: Thorpe Maltings, Thorpe the Soken, Clacton Seafront, St Osyth, and Harwich Old Town.
Okay. And that's in your suggested modification, isn't it, to PP14?
Again, I'll just need to double check that.
Yeah, you've got that in front of me. Okay. Is there anything you'd like to say about that? Anything else you'd like to say about that policy before we move on to delivering places?
No, I think we've covered that more.
Okay, good. Right. So policy DI1. Can we look first then at let's look first at I want to get a bit of a flavour as to how the council went about assessing the sort of infrastructure that would be likely to be needed. So how did the council sort of do its initial scope of the infrastructure needs of the district?
Well, we've been working with our infrastructure consultants all the way through developing the policies and actually the allocations. I think Chris Bowden should be on the line at the moment just to give you an overview of that process.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon, Ma'am. Yeah, when we were appointed by the District Council to undertake the infrastructure delivery plan.
Would you just mind putting your camera on?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Mr. Bowden.
There we go.
I can see you now.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah, so when we were appointed by the District Council to undertake the infrastructure delivery plan, it started on the basis of the NPPF requirements for a broad spectrum of infrastructure. So it really very much started on the basis of the sort of standard infrastructure that you would look to address for most developments. So of course I'm thinking education, health, transport in all its forms, highways, walking, cycling, community and leisure. I mean, obviously within that, when we were looking at the various sites, there were particular issues. For example, sites in and around Clacton, the importance of improving walking and cycling links into those. So really the approach taken was to ensure that what one might call the core infrastructure required to support growth was there and available. And obviously we worked with officers with their knowledge of the sites to ensure that all of those types of things were covered.
Okay, is there a sort of checklist that you use or any national guidance as to the things that you are meant to look at in this sort of situation?
Yeah, well, we started with the requirements of infrastructure as described in the Planning Act, and that was our sort of core starting point in section 216 of the Planning Act. There was nothing specifically within that we sought to deviate from that or sort of necessarily extend the definition of infrastructure. There's a balance to be struck as to what types of infrastructure we felt are necessary and also what was likely to be deliverable given the likely viability of the site. So we started with that as our main core element and worked from there.
Was there anything particular to tendering that led you to sort of deviate or augment that list?
Nothing specific, but within some of the topic areas, the infrastructure areas, there are obviously changing ways of delivering things. The most obvious one I'm thinking about relates to health. And so, for example, as you've just been discussing in the previous topic, there are certain areas where health outcomes are particularly important. So a lot of the growth around Clacton, to a lesser extent Harwich, it's been very much working with the CCG, who are trying to look at maybe moving away from the sort of standard this many houses means this many additional GP places. So you put in place X number of extra GPs. They're looking more at the health outcomes, how there can be improvements to general health and well-being through provision of open space, encouraging walking and cycling, as well as providing the health services there. So I think that's one example of an area where it was particularly pertinent to Clacton mainly, but also to Harwich, as I said, that type of infrastructure is delivered through the plan. So that therefore feeds through to the assessments of other requirements that are related to it that I said. So obviously leisure, access to open space, and so on. I think that's probably the primary one that I would say is particularly pertinent to tendering and the needs and issues in the district.
Okay, and what were the costs estimates based on in relation to infrastructure provision? Where did they come from?
Well, I mean, a whole variety of sources. So obviously the infrastructure providers, in most cases where they were able to provide costs for infrastructure, it was based on their experience of delivering infrastructure. Some of those things we worked with the promoters of the schemes to come to costs, things like transport. For example, sports and leisure, we use the Sport England toolkit for costings. Education, that again comes from the county, and they, I think, submitted well, in the IDP. There is an explanation of the justification for those costs and how they update those over time. Clearly, there are a number of infrastructure items it's rather difficult to be precise about the costs. So we haven't sought to put costs into the IDP for those, but to recognise they are issues that need to be addressed moving forward. So we've sought to use costs that we consider robust where we can, and where we haven't got those, then we've simply identified what the nature of the infrastructure requirement is.
Did you, were you involved in the production of the trigger point work for the large SAMU sites?
Yes, yes, I was.
So what sort of assumptions did you use for those?
Well, we sort of tend to take the approach of starting with what is the fundamental pieces of infrastructure that are required in order to deliver housing, and that could be tendering, it could be anywhere. I mean, it's fundamentals such as utilities, access, and such like. So sort of, dare one say it, the sort of belt and braces types of infrastructure that you need no matter what the type of site. Then we worked with the providers, things such as education, where obviously there are assumptions based on the expected build out rate as to when dwellings will be occupied, and therefore when they will start to create an additional child yield and how that feeds through to things. So the county were able to advise us, for example, if a new school was required, when that would be triggered. For an awful lot of the other infrastructure around, for example, community and leisure, clearly some of that land needs to be set aside for it as part of the overall development of the site, but some of those are not fundamental. So we tended to make a judgment based on what we thought was a reasonable cash flow of the development, because you have to balance up the infrastructure revision with the need to ensure that the development can deliver it. So we put in staggered trigger points through that, so that to ensure that the development would have enough cash flow to be able to do that.
Okay. To what extent did the whole point, the thing about thinking about the whole issue of sort of critical mass and trigger points, to what extent did that dictate how large, for example, a development allocation needed to be, or how quickly development needed to come forward? Thinking maybe in relation to something like a school, because that's been mentioned before during the hearings. How far did one inform the other? What was the
I mean, there's an iterative process necessarily with the IDP. So the very first version that helped to inform the plan was 2017, and we've subsequently done further work on the SAMU sites and the trigger points work. So over time, you've had the initial phasing of the sites and the scale of those sites based on the initial discussions with the promoters and the requirements of the plan. That's then fed in through the IDP work and the trigger point work, and it actually helps to identify, well, yeah, there could be problems there with that trajectory, for example, or you may need to push things back because, for example, a school is going to be needed, but it won't actually be capable of being delivered and funded until a later point. So that's actually fed through, and I think you can see as the plan has evolved over time through to the 2021 IDP, some of the trajectories have changed, so they have been informed with that, always trying to get that right balance between the need to deliver and against requirements set against the need to ensure that the developments are viable.
So were there any particular issues that arose with the allocations and tendering in relation to the provision of key bits of infrastructure?
I think the one where there was concern over time, because there wasn't an immediate solution, was for education around Clacton and the nature of that and how that would be delivered. particularly at a secondary school level. Although they're often not problems, secondary education, or certainly the education authorities tend to more commonly say secondary is less of a problem. When it becomes a problem, it's obviously quite a substantial one because you tend to provide it at a much greater scale. So throughout the process, the education authority, we worked with them, and they did have concerns. There was one point when they said, well, look, there isn't a particular solution here. And quite clearly, they're required to provide the places, so they would have to find a way, but they didn't have an optimum solution. But as the different allocations and the scales of growth that are coming forward and the phasing has changed, that has actually resulted also in the education authority being able to come to an approach, and has also given them time to really consider the best way to deal with this. And the most recent update to the IDP demonstrates what the education authority will be providing by way of secondary school education.
Okay, do you want to expand a bit on that? Is when you talk about the trajectory, you're talking about the larger sites coming online towards the end of the plan period, or? Yes.
So particularly Oakwood Park, and obviously to a lesser extent Hartley Gardens. Those trajectories, and particularly the scale of growth in the first 5 years around that part of Clacton, was causing the education authority difficulties. That problem has been not completely alleviated by doing that, but it has enabled them to look at other developments around, to pull those together in terms of assessing child yield, and to be able to come up with solutions for expansion of the existing secondary schools and ensure that they are deliverable.
Okay, so that's useful. I had a look at the infrastructure delivery plan, and I was taken by the the multicolour drawing, which has got your green, yellows, and, well, there aren't any reds on it, but green, yellow, and reds in relation to the larger allocation sites, and where there, and it's a good way of seeing immediately where there could be some problems. I wondered what parameters you used to assess. So what parameters did you use to come to that view in relation to whether or not you might find a pinch point or a problem in relation to delivery of infrastructure? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, so I'm just trying to double check as to whether, and if we didn't, perhaps we should have done, in the before you get to that traffic light summary, whether there is an explanation as to what criteria there were for the red, amber, and green. And yes, so in the review, the SAMU sites review, June 2020, in section 13 there, at the top of section 13, it gives a sort of definition of what constituted giving a red, amber, and green rating. So
which document am I looking at?
Sorry.
The reference. Have you got the EB reference?
Yes, give me a moment. It is EB 10.1.1. Yeah, EB 10.1.1, which is the Tendering Infrastructure Delivery Plan Review for 2019, which is focusing on the SAMU sites. Section 13 at the top of that, just after paragraph 13.1, there's a short summary of the traffic lights and what they mean. So green, no specific needs identified or no issue in providing the required infrastructure. Amber was possible issues in providing the required infrastructure or further work being required. And red was potentially significant issues in providing the required infrastructure. So red really was trying to identify there was a significant potential for something to be a showstopper issue. And there wasn't sufficient assurance.
You didn't. I mean, you didn't find any reds.
No.
So it's a bit of an academic question, I suppose. But there are some where you've drawn attention to the fact that there may be potential issues in relation to delivery of infrastructure. Were there any specific criteria that you used to come to that view, or was it just a matter of general judgment?
It was through the ongoing discussions with the infrastructure providers. So, for example, I think one that's been referenced for the Clacton sites was the Clacton Holland Haven Waste Recycling Centre for wastewater, where a particular solution hadn't been identified. There was a need identified, a particular solution hadn't been identified, but we sought assurance from Anglian Water as the provider that they would be able to provide a solution. And sometimes the nature of the infrastructure providers is they don't look at these things until an application comes in. So we were trying to push them to say, well, look, if an application did come in, how would you resolve this? And that actually led them then to look more seriously at this, or certainly prioritise it, perhaps would be fairer to say, so that as we come to the table now, they've looked at it and it is something that they are pushing forward through their next asset management plan period. And you've got that in the statement of common ground with them.
That's good. I think that's all my questions, really, other than I had a question about, are there any areas of particular concern? I think you've touched on that. Was there anything else you wanted to bring to my attention?
No, of concern. Those were the issues that there had been, but from our point of view, no, nothing that puts the red flag up, as it were.
Okay. I suppose the next question is a question for the council, really. Given that there is quite a long list of infrastructure requirements, so there's going to be a very long shopping list in terms of Section 106 contributions. Did the council have any thoughts on whether or not they had a list in order of priority of what they were going to require, given that some sites may not be able to deliver everything?
The SAMU sites obviously have a quite strong physical list of requirements they have to deliver, and that's been cash flowed through, and the promoters are aware of that. I think that's so I think the SAMU sites and the big allocated sites, there is a structure to the delivery of that infrastructure. I think the other sites will be delivered as and when the housing is developed and the infrastructure payments are paid. But I know with Chris, you can add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the 2017 IDP, so that's the October version, EB 10.1.2, does have in the schedule of infrastructure requirements, does have a priority column at the end. So again, section 13, different document, but it's still section 13, table 13.1, and all those subsequent pages of tables identify the priorities of infrastructure, and those are summarised. Just trying to find the neat summary. So into critical to the delivery of the emerging local plan, essential to necessary to mitigate the impacts arising from development, a high priority for policy, either to support site-specific or wider strategic objectives, or important infrastructure for effective placemaking, but unlikely to prevent development in the short to medium term. Those criteria are laid out in paragraph 1.18 of that document.
Mm. So you've got important and critical, and you've got red and blue. What's the red and blue?
Just look at the document. Sorry, number of documents open. Has it gone? Right, sorry. Red and blue is simply to help the reader differentiate where you're moving between different categories. There's nothing in that to the red and blue compared with the subsequent documents which are using a traffic light system.
Okay, right, that's fine. Thank you. That's really helpful. So in terms of viability, I assume that the how far has the infrastructure delivery plan been viability tested?
Presumably this is a me question. So when we were preparing both the viability studies, we worked quite closely with Chris, particularly on the SAMU sites, but on making sure that we'd got all the main infrastructure costs and the predicted collection costed, and also the timing and the cash flow. As well as working with Chris, we spoke a lot with the council and also with the development industry in general and the site promoters specifically, really to get a complete picture of what was likely to be required from the development. We also added a sensitivity test, what if there was an extra 10,000 a dwelling as well, just as a stress test. So I feel confident that we've covered everything that's been identified in the IDP. We did two sorts of testing really. One is a series of typologies which reflects typical development, and then for that we've used a broad average of costs that would be expected to be attached to development in tendering, and then where we've tested the specific SAMU sites, we've followed completely the cash flow and the costs that Chris provided. And then Mr. Bowden, sorry, the IDP consultant. I can direct you, I've just written down to where it's discussed in the studies, if that's helpful. So EB 9.1.1, that's the most recent of our two studies. And then in there, starting at paragraph 2.18 to 2.23, there's a discussion of the infrastructure costs and how we've accounted for them. And also table 2.5 and annex 1 are probably the best places to look. So I'm very comfortable really from those discussions that everything's been covered in our modelling. I guess where if there were any surprises later along the line, it would be something that, looking at in decision taking, you'd sort of look at the land value and the taking those against the land value, but I don't anticipate any that we've missed. Does that answer your question enough, or do you want any more detail?
No, I think that answers the
I'll
question.
give you some numbers, but I don't know if that's really helpful at this point.
If the numbers are in the documents, I can them at leisure.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So talking then, you mentioned there about if it was needed, are there any surprises? You could look at decisions later along the line in relation to viability testing. That was the last thing you said, wasn't it?
Yes. What I meant by that, Mum, really was that if there was a sudden high expensive need that Chris hadn't picked up or the council hadn't picked up along the way, when the application came in, and presumably if it came in with a viability assessment for that site, the additional cost is something you would expect to be taken from the land value rather than from development.
If we could jump then to the wording of policy DI1. I'm looking also at the proposed amendments. Just to check. There's an additional paragraph then on the end. Can we jump down to the second part of the policy where it starts? Exceptions to this policy will only be considered whereby. So these are instances where appropriate mitigation in relation to, for example, the delivery of infrastructure can't be provided, and there are 4 criteria there. So the first is it's proven that the benefit of the development proceeding without full mitigation outweighs the collective harm. Second is a fully transparent, open book viability assessment has proven that full mitigation cannot be afforded, allowing only for the minimum level of developer profit and landowner receipt necessary for the development to proceed. I think that, well, my concern is that that part of that policy may be imprecise. Because how is the council going to define what a minimum level of developer profit is? Have you thought about that, Mr. Brindley?
Yes, we have thought about that. I think this was comments from the HBF as well in terms of some of their comments. We did look into this, and I did discuss this with Laura. Sorry, Mrs. Easton. Could you comment on that, Mrs. Easton?
Of course, yes. PPG 2019 does give a range for developer profit or developer return of 15 to 20%. And I think as an industry standard, one would expect most developer return to be within that 15 to 20%. I think that there'd be exceptions where there was either huge risk or no risk, but most developer return you'd expect to be within there. We did use 20% for the viability study, so we were towards the top of that. And if I was asked to define a minimum developer return, I'd go to that paragraph and say it was 15%. Would it help if I gave you the paragraph number?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd have to look round at my PPG though.
Actually, just a correction on that, it's actually Gladman Homes representation that commented on that. Gladman.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's no definition of term minimum developer profit.
Oh yeah, it's paragraph 18. And it's 15 to 20% of gross development value.
Okay. It doesn't set out anywhere in the plan that that's what the minimum development profit will be. I think the council need to have a look at that clause B and think about whether it could be recast in a way that makes it very clear that the developer will be required to demonstrate why it isn't viable, but gives the developer some certainty as to what the range might be, because at the moment that's not in there.
Would it be helpful to put, I mean, we could put the 15 to 20%, the sort of, it's difficult to start putting numbers in plans like this. So.
I wouldn't put 15 to 20% in, because 15 will be 15 to 20%, yeah. 15.
Yeah, that's right.
14.51, which will be, that, so I wouldn't put a number in. But I would think about it, because when you initially read that, it sounds, it just sounds imprecise. What about, and I'm not saying this is right, but this is sort of the sort of area I want you to think about. So saying something about allowing a level of developer profit commensurate with the risk of development. Something along those lines. Any suggestions, Miss Easton? No.
No, you could. That sounds perfect. You could put with reference to PPG. But
yeah, I have a slight
agree.
problem with this, because if you're dealing with investment funds, they're looking for something like a 20% IRR on developments. They'd say that was their minimum level of developer profit. So
Which is probably why you don't want to put minimum in.
yeah.
Got no problem with the intent of the policy, it's just how
Yeah.
it's passed. Okay, so shall I put it on the list of things that the council are going to look at?
And if I may just jump in and add something, that the return would be different for the affordable housing as well. I don't know if you need to account for that in your comment.
Simply the level of risk would be different as well, depending upon who's delivering the affordable housing as well, which will impact upon the developer profit. So it's going to vary from site to site, and I suppose the council need to take a view on that. But I'm just not sure the word minimum is the right word to use in that context. Okay. Right, so the council are going to go and have a think about that. Are they, Mr. Brindley?
Yes,
Right.
we will, Ma'am.
Thank you. So last question then, in terms of monitoring, I see your suggested modifications. You've come up with a long updated table as to how the council are going to monitor. Do you want to just take me through how that's arisen and what's in it?
I think Mr. Guy was
going
going
to say, actually, before we move on, you have that modification at the bottom of policy DI1, which
Yes.
refers to the potential for introducing SIL.
Yes. Yes.
Just to confirm, I haven't got any problems with that, and I think it's necessary.
Thank you, Ma'am.
Okay, so let's move on to monitoring then. So do you want to just take me through how you've got to that? Did you need to say something, Miss Easton, because you got your virtual hand up? It's okay.
No,
Mr. Cliver.
Thank you, Mel. No, happy to do so. In the plan that we submitted, our monitoring section consisted of a few bullet points highlighting very high level the kind of things that we would be looking at in terms of monitoring. But it came quite apparent when we looked at the plans of our colleagues in Colchester and Braintree that they've gone a step further than we had. And it made us review our situation, and on reflection, perhaps what we had in the plan originally wouldn't provide an adequate framework for carrying out future monitoring. So the approach we've taken in the table is that we've essentially taken the objectives from the beginning of the Section 2 local plan and set them out in a table, and then provided the key indicators that we would be looking at, providing enough detail that the monitoring process would be useful, but not committing the council to so much detail that we have to monitor every single possible permutation of indicator, because depending on resource availability and depending on the matters pertinent at the time, it may not always be appropriate to monitor every possible indicator. But the ones that we put in there relate to the objectives from the beginning of the plan, and because the local plan is designed to achieve those objectives, it makes sense that what we monitor also links to those objectives as well. So, for example, housing completions by type, location, and the availability of land for housing. That's something we do already, but it's important that we carry on doing that to ensure that we're meeting with our objectives for housing delivery. On retail, updated assessments of retail floor space capacity. And what we're talking about there is keeping the evidence base updated in terms of what the retail needs are going to be. And you heard from Ms. Duffy earlier about the update to the information that we've got. Again, keeping it fairly vague because the nature of retail planning is just changing so rapidly. And in 3 years' time, we may be measuring it against a completely different metric. On terms of infrastructure provision, we'll be looking at the projects that are identified in the plan and how they're being delivered. I mean, for example, some of the big highways projects that had been identified in the work that the County Council had done have been delivered, such as the roundabout improvements at Freighting and Wheeley, which were seen as key infrastructure projects to unlock capacity for future growth. But we've also got the provision of financial contributions towards such schemes. So at the council, we do have a monitoring officer who looks at the contributions that are secured, make sure that they are put against the right line in the table for what they're to be spent on, and ticks off when that money is spent and keeps an eye on that. In terms of education and health, the delivery of the necessary facilities and the securing of the contributions through planning obligations. So it's very similar kind of metric really that we already monitor through our officer. Sustainable health, sort of modal splits and self-containment. So that's via census updates, but also any updates to evidence that are undertaken within that period. We're not committing to a, every year we're going to update the our highways and transport strategy, but where there are updates to relevant information, the census is a key one, it will give us an indication as to whether modal shift is taking place or not, and whether we need to do more than we were already doing to address that. The historic environment, as I referred to earlier, we do now have an adopted heritage strategy which contains various proposals aimed at conserving and enhancing the historic environment. And rather than providing a specific list within the local plan, what we can do is monitor generally how we are delivering on some of those recommendations in the heritage strategy. In terms of biodiversity, we have the RAMS, Essex RAMS in place now, and we work with other authorities across the county, pooling the money to deliver the projects that will mitigate the impact that arises as a result of growth, and the monitoring of other relevant facilities or compensation measures, mitigation measures through planning obligations, without being overly specific in the plan as to precisely what we're going to be measuring, allowing a bit of flexibility. Water and climate change. So this is number of water manager developments incorporating water management schemes, and those approved contrary to advice from the Environment Agency, which used to be a key national measure actually, because the Environment Agency historically would be able to call in decisions that went against their advice. It's not so much the case now, but we are an area where we do have areas of high flood risk, and where we have to think very carefully when we're considering schemes in the flood zone. And in terms of tourism promotion, updates to the holiday parks study. And one of the recommendations in the work that Frontline did for us, which we referred to earlier, was that we do undertake a relatively regular review of that work, so that the information about numbers of pitches and whether they are in tourism use, residential use, and how occupancy conditions are applied is maintained going forward. We do that already because we have a lot of these caravan parks where we have to keep an eye on compliance with the occupancy conditions. But by updating that kind of work, that provides us a way of monitoring any changes in the situation. And then we've got a new tourism strategy that's coming through the system and will be adopted by the council soon. And one of the metrics will be to see how we're delivering upon the aims and objectives of the overall tourism strategy. And our policies in our plan all contribute towards building a healthy economy for the tourism industry in our area. So as I said at the beginning, what we didn't want to do was have such a specific list that it causes us problems in the future if priorities or resources change, but at least gives a bit of a clearer indication than the current bullet point list we have in the plan as to the kind of things that we would be looking at to see whether this plan is working or not.
Okay. Most of that sounds perfectly sensible. Just had two questions on it, really. The first is in relation to the historic environment. You're going to monitor it by looking at the delivery of projects and proposals set out within the Council's adopted Heritage Strategy 2020. Is that the one I was looking at earlier? And does it contain a list of a set list of projects? Is it defined? It's
Yes.
not nebulous.
Yes, at the back there is a schedule of recommended projects. Now the council isn't committed to delivering upon each and every one, so we would be reporting on the ones that we are looking to deliver. I mean, that includes things like working with communities to prepare a local list of non-designated assets, includes undertaking reviews of the conservation areas, and various projects in there. Some of them will be prioritised by the council for delivery. Others may be sort of longer term projects that we get onto as and when time and resources allow. And they actually are defined within the strategy as long, medium and short term as well.
I'm looking in the strategy now. Are these the oh, I see. So I've got 6 objectives, and then I've got local projects. There's only 3 local projects. Is it the objectives you're looking at?
It's well, for the purposes of monitoring in this table, it was the delivery of projects that we were intending to report on.
Okay, because there's only 3 of them.
I think there's now I'm just going to get the document up as well, and
Look, looking at page 82, the following one-off projects have been drawn from the objectives in this study.
yes, it's more the actions, Ma'am, which start page 71. So we've got, for example, I mean, the first few examples, reassess the condition and state of as assets on the heritage at risk register.
And they're within,
within that table. So they're actions as opposed to projects, but they could be described as projects as well. Okay. Create and adopt a local list, adoption of character appraisals and management plans for every conservation area, utilisation of local authority enforcement powers. There's a huge list of actions there which the council will take decisions on in terms of what the priorities are, and we would look to monitor and report on that.
Okay, so there's a list of achievable actions that the council that have already been identified that the council could take.
Yes.
And monitor. Okay. What about similarly for the tourism objective, the last objective, tourism promotion, delivery of the aims of the tourism strategy. Have you got the tourism strategy in the evidence base?
I'm just going to check. I mean, there is the existing tourism strategy. Here we are. So
6.
Yes, EB 6.4.1 is the emerging one, which is just awaiting approval. EB 6.4.2 is the existing one, albeit a bit superseded by events. It's a bit long in the tooth. So the emerging tourism strategy contains sort of fairly high level objectives for delivering on the tourism economy. So we've got a 10-point plan. So there's objectives around brand identity, events, promotion of the district and digital marketing, improving the seafront offer, promotion of the district as an area for outdoor activities. And the planning section of that is to guide planning policy to protect quality visitor attractions and visitor accommodation. We had a bit of a discussion earlier on about visitor accommodation and working with the private sector to attract new high quality tangible assets in our towns to attract and retain visitors. And Mr. Brindley and yourself had a bit of a discussion about the priority areas for regeneration, and Clacton Town Centre and Seafront being one of those. One of the projects there is working with the owner of the pier and the pavilion to develop those into, the best tourist attractions on the East Coast, and bring in new attractions and facilities to those areas. So that's the working with the private sector. And in terms of working with the private sector to increase the number of high quality bed spaces, we have worked with some of the big hotel brands to bring them into Clacton Town Centre. So we have 2 of the major hotels right on the outskirts of the town centre and on the seafront. So these are ongoing things. And there's a link to heritage there as well. So developing and delivering projects around heritage, the Mayflower, and its connotations and association with Harwich. And this year is Clacton-on-Sea's 150th year, its 150th birthday, and there's a whole load of incentives and attractions and events being planned for when we come out of the COVID crisis.
So you're satisfied that there are sufficient tangible objectives within the tourism strategy that you could actually be monitored against?
I think so, Mum, yes.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Right, that was my last question. I think there's some other matters we needed to touch on. I'm conscious that I've got some people here who may have other things that they need to do, Ms. Easton and Mr. Bowden. So you're obviously very welcome to stay, but if you need to shoot off, now might be the time to do it. So thank you very much for your help. I found that really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the other matters that we were going to touch on, you mentioned earlier you wanted to talk about Natural England's advice. You'd had something back from them?
We have had, Ma'am. We haven't had a formal response from Natural England, but we've had an initial indication from the officer that we've been speaking to that their initial view is that the HRA hasn't covered the Houlihan legal judgment because of the timings of it. It was released too late to be able to take that into account. We've already spoken to our colleagues, Mr. Owen at LUC, who would be prepared to undertake a piece of work to ensure that judgment is properly covered through the HRA work. But what we are waiting on is just a formal response from Natural England to confirm that that's their understanding, that more work needs to be done to ensure that the Houlihan court judgment is covered off.
I thought LUC said that they were confident that it was covered, and it was just that Natural England, we weren't sure whether Natural England had covered it.
Yes, I think the advice from LUC is that they could do a bit of work just to make doubly sure that is the case.
Okay.
We can provide a statement on that if you like, Ma'am. I'm just sort of paraphrasing the exchange of correspondence that I've seen so far.
Do you want to forward me the exchange of correspondence, as long as there's nothing you don't want me to see in there, but if there isn't, you could forward that to me.
I don't think it's that controversial, Ma'am. I'm sure we could package that up and get that over to you.
Okay, right. So there was an issue then that we missed yesterday, which is the one about settlement boundaries. Just see if I can find. Yeah. Yeah, let me just open up the policy. This was more about how this would be applied. So, and it goes back to the issue of what happens when you get rather than dealing with allocations, which the settlement hierarchy is very clear about why sites have been picked, where they've been picked, because it's, in relation to sustainability and the level of services. So I'm not dealing with the policies that you've come up with in the plan. I'm more thinking about how the policy will be applied in a development management context. So SP2 says, outside of settlement development boundaries, the council will consider any planning application in relation to the settlement hierarchy and any other relevant policies in the plan. That's fine. So let's think first about the settlement hierarchy. Well, it's very clear that if a site is close or within the close to the urban the boundary of one of your strategic urban settlements, except that it's the most sustainable settlement in the borough, so that's not unclear. Or if it's in a smaller rural settlement, it's one of the less, or if it isn't, if it's a smaller rural settlement, it's not so sustainable. What would you do if you had a scheme that came in close to or adjoining a boundary, say, in one of these other settlements, or something like a rural service centre? Okay. How would a development management colleague be able to make an assessment then in relation to sustainability, because it's comparative? Yes,
no, understood. I mean, in the suggested wording that we've put forward to you, before I answer that point, we put forward some suggested wording which would say that outside of settlement development boundaries, the council will consider any planning application in relation to the pattern and scales of growth promoted through the settlement hierarchy and policy SPL1 and any other relevant policies in the plan. I'm still not 100% convinced that that solves the issue. And the other thought is, do we need to mention the hierarchy at all within that section? Could be the opposite way of dealing with it. But to answer your question, in the supporting text for the settlement hierarchy, as you mentioned, it's fairly clear that the top rung of the hierarchy, we're looking at the largest levels of growth, and in the lower rung of the hierarchy, we're looking at more limited growth. Yeah. But I've just highlighted a few paragraphs, and if you don't mind, I'll just go through those and see whether they help at all with this issue. So 3.2.1.4, which is in relation to strategic.
I need to look at the SN document for that. 3.1.2.4.
Sorry, 3.2.1. 1.4. That's the version I'm looking at anyway. It may be different to yours. But it's the supporting text before policy SPL1. So you may want to look at the submitted plan, Ma'am.
(3.2.1.1.4).
That's right, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So for strategic urban settlements, it's envisaged that they will accommodate the largest proportion of the district's increase in housing stock over the plan period. So that's broadly in line with what we've just said. So larger scale development. 3.2.1.2.3, which is in respect of smaller urban settlements, we're applying a sustainable, fair and proportionate approach to the distribution of housing growth. So proportionate being the key word there, and the second largest proportion of the district's increase in development. At rural service centres, the growth is envisaged to be a level that is fair, achievable and sustainable for each of the settlements concerned. And again, it's what is achievable and sustainable, both in terms of what the infrastructure can deal with in that location, fair in terms of what is proportionate for the location in question. Then going to the end of that paragraph, development that will make a meaningful contribution towards addressing local housing needs. So the key word there being local housing needs, supporting the village economy and assisting with overall housing growth. 3.2.1.4.2, where we get into the smaller rural settlements, we're talking about small scale development which is sympathetic to the rural and often historic character of the settlement. 3.2.1.4.4, developments which exceed 10 dwellings inside. The general expectation is it wouldn't be permitted unless there is local support or an approved neighbourhood plan, or the need for affordable housing to be addressed through a rural exception site. So you're looking at the smaller developments of 9 or fewer generally, going to the smaller rural settlements. So there's guidance in there, but I'm of two minds on this topic. I think we either try and write something into the plan to give it clarity, or we remove the reference of the settlement hierarchy from SPL2, so that it would just read, outside of settlement development boundaries, the council will consider any planning applications in relation to any other relevant policies in this plan.
If you take out the reference to SPL1 within SPL2, what is the point in policy SPL1?
Well, SPL1 has helped to determine our distribution of our allocations. So the largest allocations are around Clacton, Harwich, and smaller ones as you go down there. So the SPL1 is not just a development management policy, it's a strategic policy that has guided the spatial strategy.
My gut feeling is, and I'm talking off the top of my head here, but to remove a reference to SPL1 within SPL2 is possibly throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because SPL1 does what it says. It gives you an order of settlements in terms of this is why we allocated what we allocated where. That's all really sensible, and the supporting text to that sets that out very clearly, and you can use the supporting text to clearly identify, like I said before, that the top order settlements are the most sustainable, so therefore are likely to be the focus for growth, and the least sustainable are not. And you've even put a level of 10 in there, so that's really clear. What isn't clear is what you do in the murky middle of schemes that come in, which are exactly the ones that your colleagues will be. I don't know whether it is your colleagues. It could be. I don't know whether you work in development management. It could be you two dealing with it. But how do they apply that policy? Because the policy doesn't give any direction then as to the likely scale of development that might be appropriate in those sort of settlements, if indeed at all. Like, it's somewhere between large-scale growth and not very much growth at all, clearly, because large-scale growth is what's appropriate around Clacton, Harwich and the tendering Colchester borders Garden Community, although that's referenced later on. On the smaller settlements, you put a limit on. But how do they use the settlement hierarchy to gauge the sort of level of sustainability of any given site? Is there something you could do to the supporting text to highlight that, direct them to that?
It might be, Mum, but I think the problem that we've had, and I'm speaking from experience really of the last few years, is that when we had an earlier attempt at producing a local plan, what we tried to do with that was be very sort of specific about what we expected within the different rungs of the hierarchy, to the extent that smaller settlements, it was no more than 10. Key rural service centres, it was no more than 50, and then it sort of staged up each time you went up the hierarchy, and then we ended up in a period of time where we weren't with an up-to-date local plan and we didn't have a 5-year supply, so we were having to consider applications on their merits outside of the settlement boundaries, and what we found is that where we had written prescriptive requirements into the plan, we weren't winning those arguments on appeal because there wasn't enough of an evidential basis behind the figure that we picked. So what we tended to do in those circumstances was, when we took applications to committee for consideration, we would give them an indication of whether the development was considered to be proportionate for the settlement it related to. So what we did is we provided an indication of what the percentage increase in dwelling stock would be arising from that development, taking into account committed developments that had already got through the process, and compared that to what the expected overall dwelling stock increase for the district would be as a percentage of growth. And generally speaking, it tended to be around sort of 16%. So we were looking at 16% housing stock growth across the district. And if the application was broadly in line with the sort of a 16% increase in growth for the village, we were able to report to members that this is broadly proportionate for the location in question. Then you've got all the other factors, like whether the school could cope with that scale of growth, and the environmental impact, highways impacts that factored into it as well. If the development was massively above that, say it was like a 50% increase in the size of the village, we would report to members that appeared to be a disproportionate level of growth that wasn't in line with the spirit of what we were trying to achieve through the local plan, and we would reject proposals like that. But it was a planning judgment at the end of the day on each of those. It was a planning judgment when we tried to apply very prescriptive guidance to this. We were finding that we were struggling to defend it on appeal, but where we took a sort of more balanced view of the benefits and the harm of the development, that was the kind of approach that we took. I'd be reluctant to put percentages into the plan for the reasons that I've just explained. And to me, I think it's going to be difficult to make modifications that cover all of those potential circumstances, because each one is going to be a bit different. We've had a recent application at Elmsted Market, which is to the west of the district, which was related to the Landswood Park expansion, which had 70 dwellings worth of essentially enabling development associated with it. Under normal circumstances, we would say a development of 70 dwellings on the edge of the village would be disproportionate for Elmsted Market, bearing in mind the other developments that have already been approved. But because this one enabled the expansion of Landswood Park, the committee decision was to approve the application because the exceptional circumstances justified it. So I'm more in the camp of we consider these when they come up, We consider them on their merits as they arise, and try and deal with them as exceptions to policy, rather than inviting, as I mentioned, I think on the first day of the examination, I don't want to put anything in the local plan that gives the impression that somebody can put in an application that's outside of the settlement boundary and have a fair chance that it's going to be approved, because we're not inviting those applications. We'll consider them, but we're not inviting them.
I'm thinking, I mean, I'm not proposing any kind of percentage figure, because you'll be a hostage to fortune then, and I don't think that that's something that's appropriate in this case. I'm thinking more about saying something more about the smaller rural settlements and the smaller urban settlements and the rural service centres, that refers to the level of services that they have within them, or signposts the fact that they've already, some of those settlements have already had a proportionate or large amount of growth attributed to them, and therefore along those kind of lines. So it's more about saying more in the supporting text about what it is about the character of those settlements that have led the council to the view that this is why they're in this part of the hierarchy, and that's why we've allocated that amount of growth to them, those sites within them. So it gives you more an indication about why you've made the decision to make your allocations at that point. So if you come to a situation where you have to decide on an application that is close to a settlement boundary, in one of these middling, don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way, but you know, it's not at the top, it's not at the bottom of the settlement hierarchy. You can reference the fact that it wasn't allocated for growth because it only has a corner shop and a hairdresser's. Do you see what I mean? Because this is all of it, its place in the hierarchy is relative to everything else. But if you're making a decision on an individual application rather than a decision about attributing amounts of growth, where it is in the hierarchy means less. So its position in the hierarchy doesn't really mean as much, because you're not making a relative allocation. You're making a decision just on that one, and it's a yes or no answer. So it's something else that you can hang it on. Does that make any sense? I see you're nodding, but I'm not sure.
It does. It does make sense. It's just how we describe that within the wording, I think. So would you like us to perhaps have a look at the supporting text? Are you happy with the suggested modification to the policy itself, broadly?
I think I am, yes. But let me get back to you on that. I think I am.
Okay.
Yeah. But my view is it is more about what's in the supporting text and actually changing the policy. I'm not asking you to change the order or anything like that, or the classifications, or that all makes sense. It's the what a decision maker, because that's what the plan is now for. Now that you've made your applications, it's what the decision maker will be able to hang the decision on.
Yes.
And
okay.
It's difficult. It would be really difficult because there isn't. I mean, I'm able to say why you have put the settlements in the hierarchy where you have, because I've got all the evidence in relation to the services and all the different villages, etc.
I think I understand. I think we can come up with some wording which probably within the different categories within the supporting text requires applicants to have regard to, you know, the size of the settlement, the character of the settlement, and the provision of services in that settlement. Yeah. And I think we could weave something into the wording which covers that and provides a bit more guidance for anybody that needs to make a decision. Yeah,
but I appreciate what you're saying about trying to move away from numbers or proportionate allocations, etc. Because I think that's probably far too precise. And you're going to have some settlements that have already probably used up all of their allocation, which would mean they couldn't see any growth at all over the plan period, which may not be appropriate. So yeah, don't go for percentages, but think about the criteria.
Yes. Okay, I understand. I think we can do that.
Okay, have a go and we'll look at it and then we'll see where we get to.
Thank you.
So I think can I just summarize where I think I'm waiting on at the end of today. So you're going to recast policy SAE7, which is the one with the which name I've forgotten, which is in Harwich, which has the supermarkets at the bottom and the
Stanton Euro Park.
Stanton Euro Park.
Yeah, and incidentally, Madam, I mentioned earlier that we were awaiting announcement from government about Freeports, and Freeport East has been included. So that's good. A lot more work to do on it, but really pleased about that. And that Stanton Euro Park site is in the location where we were considering Freeport. So
very good. So also PP7. You're going to provide me with the list of the things you were coming off the top of your head about what the uses were on the different allocations that were going into the employment policy. Yeah. PP6, we were looking at the issue of unacceptable conflicts. You know, that issue about conflicts, resolving conflicts.
Yes.
You're also going to provide me with the gold map for Clacton Town Centre. Are you aware of any other matters from previous days that I'm waiting on? I prepared a list yesterday of what had happened yesterday that I think you've got. I'll just, after we finish today, I'll go through where I think we are with each one of the policies. You'll probably get a list from me tomorrow.
That's fine, Ma'am. Yes, no, thank you. We did get the email via Andrew as to the relevant areas that we were looking at from yesterday. So there's still a fair bit of work we're doing on the open spaces, paragraph 77 of the MPPF. We were going to look at the water conservation, drainage and sewage policy and the local geology sites.
Yeah, I had a look at that. I found the logs document in the evidence base, which I'd skimmed initially and hadn't actually looked at the list of proposed log sites. Have you had a look at them? I
haven't myself, no, I'm not intimately familiar with the recommendations of that document.
Well, there's a section of them which are actually SSSIs. Then there's a middle section that which I'll talk about in a second. Then there's a bottom section which are ones that they're thinking about allocating, which aren't yet allocated. But the middle ones, I mean, one is a wall that has been built with cobbles in it from different places. One is a rocky outcrop. One is within a quarry. Another is, I can't remember what the other one is. They're not what I expected at all. I was expecting cliffs and coastal areas as you were discussing, but they're not. Some of them are constructed. They're built. One of them is a listed building.
Yes, I think we're going back to the authors, and we think that needs more work. A lot of them, it crosses over with heritage assets, designated or undesignated.
It does, yeah.
So I think that does need a look at. So we're going to come back to you on that.
Okay.
On the heritage policies from today, Mum, and the recommendations in the statement of common ground with Historic England, we touched on it briefly earlier, but are you going to come back to us with your thoughts on what Historic England have asked for? Because there was quite a lot in there, wasn't there? They've asked for quite a lot of additional text to go into the policies.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Sorry, I meant to add to that list. You're going to look at the policy DI1 and the issue of minimum profit.
Thank you. Affordable housing, we were going to look at the issue of the new MPPF and the affordable market housing, and see whether anything could be included. But we did have that discussion about perhaps updating the SHMA to provide a more solid evidence base going forward if we're not necessarily making changes to the local plan. You kindly got back to us on self-build and the care home policy. Thank you. Telecommunications, we're going to provide, and I know we've been working on some supporting text in relation to health infrastructure.
Okay.
We've just discussed the settlement hierarchy. We were going to look at, how we've referenced in the holiday parks policy, sort of the log cabins and the sort of centre park style development that we aspire to achieve. Have a look at whether that is better presented in the supporting text.
Okay.
So we've been keeping that's on the list. Something on priority areas for regeneration in the supporting text, to perhaps provide a bit more clarity as to what it is that we're actually doing in those areas that are listed. And some of that information we provided in the hearing statement, but we can work up some text to go into the plan. And I think we agree with your views that that is helpful to the plan if we have that.
I don't think it has to be an awful lot of work. I just think it needs to be something that directs the reader to the fact that it's something the council have been working on for some time, and that it's not just that this policy in the plan is the council's some efforts in relation to regeneration, because I know it's not, but I think that needs to be just the reader's attention needs to be drawn to that.
Thank you. I think they're the main things that we know we're looking at. I mean, obviously, there's opportunity for us to correspond with Andrea to ensure that we've picked everything up. But I just had a couple of things I wanted to ask you, if that was okay. One was in relation to sustainability appraisal and how you might envisage that process progressing from this point, because we're anticipating that an update to the sustainability appraisal is required, and we can get consultants commissioned on that to do that work fairly quickly. But it's just understanding how that might fit in with the timescales and receipt of letters and what have you. And the other point that I wanted to raise was about how we deal with modifications to the policies maps, because in SM1 we've got quite a lot of suggestions for changes to settlement boundaries or designations on the policies maps, which we haven't discussed in any detail as part of the examination process. And I just wanted to understand whether you wanted us to put those into the main modifications document, or whether you see those as additional modifications to be undertaken at the council's discretion, or how did you want to deal with those proposed changes to maps?
They need to be advertised along with. I had envisaged that you would be advertising your additional modifications alongside your main modifications anyway. I mean, the distinguishing factor between the two of them is one set I'm recommending for soundness, and the other set that the council are recommending need to be or want to include themselves. So that's why because I can't recommend things that aren't necessary for soundness, that's why I can't recommend the additional modifications. But obviously the council nevertheless think they're necessary, so I think they should happen at the same time, and any changes to the policies maps should be done at that time as well. So I'll do the whole lot at one time.
Okay, so would we advertise them in those categories then? Main modifications, additional modifications, and modifications to the policies maps?
Yeah.
That's very clear. Thank you. Yeah. Understood. Thank you very much. Yes, and sustainability appraisal. Your thoughts, Mum, if you have any at this stage on what we might need to do on that.
Oh, with the sustainability appraisal, well, ultimately it's a matter for the council. So it's up to you to decide which ones that you think need to go through sustainability appraisal. But basically, any policy where there's been a significant material change. So, and I would err on the side of caution. So obviously something like SAMO 2, I'd expect to see that sustainability appraised because that has changed quite significantly. Where changes are very minor, you probably don't need to have a sustainability appraisal done on them. But anything where you think there's a significant material change, I just err on the side of caution and have that done.
Okay.
You won't want to go out to saying it's just can't speak sustainability appraisal before you get before we've bottomed out what the list of main modifications actually are, and before we get to until you've had my interim letter. Now I'll say at this point there won't be anything that will surprise you in the interim letter. Anything that I think has been an issue we have discussed, so there's going to be no surprises from that point of view. You won't be getting the interim letter. That is to say, I haven't done the site visits yet. So this is it's a very different situation from a normal examination, because normally I would have been there and I've seen the sites, and by now I would know exactly where we were going, but I haven't seen the site. So I'm assuming that everything I've heard is going to make perfect sense when I go and look at the site. But because I can't be sure of that, we'll work on the assumption that everything is going as planned. And when I come back from the site visits, if there's anything that I think isn't what I thought it was, then I will obviously be in touch. Okay. And over the next couple of weeks, we will be there are some issues which obviously we outlined today that we still need to bottom out in terms of minor changes to wording. So there'll be quite a bit of informal email correspondence through the programme officer while we work that up. But that process is up because we've had the time at the end of each session. That process is obviously already started and is already underway. So I would hope that in about 2 weeks from now, you should have a very, sorry, you're flickering, you're disappearing on and off my screen. So if I look a bit distracted, it's because my screen's gone black. I would hope that from about 2 weeks from now, we would have I'd have done all the site visits. I'd have managed to get you a letter formally outlining the things that need to be changed, and any other main modifications. Some of these things we're already working on, and the main modifications will all have been mostly bottomed out. So I think within because I'm still waiting on things from you. So we've got, say, for example, stuff like the local green space work. I won't have had that until you've given it to me. So the question you asked me was when you thought sustainability appraisals should start. I think you'd probably be thinking about getting someone in about 3-4 weeks' time. Does that sound about right?
It does sound right. Thank you.
In terms of, I also said to you at the start that some additional consultation might be necessary before we go to main modifications. The more we've talked through the issues at the hearings, quite a few of my concerns have been, you've answered a lot of the questions that I had. So I'm still not entirely sure. I still need to think about SAMO 2 and the extent of changes to that. But if you do need to go out to additional consultation, it'll be on very few policies. So it may be that you don't need to do it at all, and we can do it all via main modifications, which will cut a stage out, really, make things slightly quicker. But we'll see how that bottoms out over the next couple of weeks. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Did you want to do a closing statement?
Yes, if you don't mind, Mum.
Thank
you very much.
Now's probably the time to do it.
Okay, thank you. So over the last 2 weeks, Mum, I think we've witnessed a masterclass in how to conduct a virtual local plan examination. And on behalf of my colleagues and our elected members, I congratulate you on the manner in which you've conducted proceedings in these challenging times. Many years of work have gone into the preparation of our long-awaited local plan, and so we've been particularly impressed by the way in which in just a few weeks you've been able to absorb and understand thousands of pages of evidence, topic papers, hearing statements and suggested modifications. And we also thank you for the way in which you've been willing to discuss your thoughts and concerns and invite ideas and solutions as we've gone along. I think this has been very useful, not only for the council, but also for members of the public who may be watching the proceedings from home. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Andrea for the incredible way in which she's handled the exchange of documentation and information, organised all the meeting invites, and how quickly she embraced and adapted this very new way of working. As always, Andrea, we thank you for a job well done. I'd like to thank Karen, Judy and Matt from our IT team who've helped us to prepare for this virtual event and who've made themselves available throughout the last 2 weeks to deal with any issues. I mean, as it happened, other than a few missing hands on the first couple of days, the IT system worked very well, and I think the event has been a huge success. As well as thanking all the members of my team and our consultants for their hard work and support throughout the whole process, I'd like to thank the participants who have taken an active interest in the planning of our district and for the excellent and clear manner in which they put their concerns, ideas and suggestions across. Ma, we hope you now have most of the information you need to come to your conclusions on the legal compliance and soundness of our Section 2 local plan. And whilst we are anticipating recommendations for main modifications to make the plan sound and the need to carry out some further consultation and work, we are hopeful that this plan is now turning the final corner onto the home straight with the checkered flag in sight. And that we'll be in a position, hopefully later on this year, to at last have a fully up-to-date adopted local plan to guide sustainable development in our district and support our aspirations for high-quality development and tackling climate change. Ma, with that, we hope you enjoy your visit to our district to look at some of our sites. We wish you well in preparing your report and look forward in due course to your interim findings. I know there will continue to be an exchange of information in writing via the programme officer in the coming weeks. But if you think of any other information you require from us, please don't hesitate to ask, as my team and I will be only too happy to help. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So I think that brings us to the end of the formal sessions. I'd just like to thank you all for your participation and your unending patience with the virtual format. I found the sessions really very helpful, and I've enjoyed the time that I've spent virtually online with you. I think I have everything that I need. As I said, I will be in contact with the various amendments that we've been discussing over the next few weeks, and I am very much looking forward to my trip to tendering. So with that, thank you very much, and go and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mum. Thank you. All the best.